Without further ado, I'm going to give you our author and presenter, Gregory.
Okay. Thank you for coming. Good night. I don't think I can top that. I was a dance student in a European history course at Poly, and I would go on to teach AP European history at Rio Grande High School for 19 years. The problem with Dan, and I've told him this before, is he's so interesting you forget to take notes. So at the end of one of his lectures, I would look down and there would be a blank page, but thankfully I remembered some of the better stories and stole them and used them on a couple of decades of Rio Grande High School students. And I'm talking about Rio Grande because that's where I was raised, and if I can get there we go. Here I am, see, still wearing suspenders. You can tell I was a little neurotic. I was raised during the Cold War. Note that I'm not only wearing suspenders, I'm also wearing a belt. We might get nuked by the Russians, but by golly, I was going to keep my pants up. That's probably my first day of school, and this was my school. This is the two-room branch elementary school in the upper Rio Grande Valley, built in 1881. We had first through fourth was in the right-hand side, 5th through 8th was in the left-hand side, 2 teachers, 74 kids, and I got a superb education. We still had desks with inkwells. Of course, we had no idea what they were. My students always looked at me in amazement when I tried to explain the concept of dialing O to get long distance. They looked at me as if I were some kind of Neanderthal. But those inkwells were still there. Of course, we were in the age of ballpoint pens, but I got a wonderful education. And I think that's probably why I became a history teacher. If you go to school in a school that was built in 1881, history kind of rubs off on you by osmosis. And there was history not too far away. Just over the hill from the school is the Branch family graveyard. Francis Branch, who came to the Rio Grande Valley in 1837, when the principal population was grizzly bears the size of Volkswagen minivans. He would eventually settle there and run the 37,000-acre Rancho Santa Manuela. That's his tombstone, the big one. And then very poignantly, these 3 little tombstones next to his are those of 3 daughters who died within several weeks of smallpox that a visitor had brought to the adobe with him. In those days, it was very common for rancheros to give shelter to travelers, which has a connection to the San Miguel mission story, but extremely tragic. The other thing about that graveyard is this old tombstone in one corner, and it's difficult to decipher, but it says Hemi. Peter died age 52. PJ, he died at the age of 15. Well, the Hemis were a father and son who were lynched from the Pacific Coast Railway Bridge at the foot of Crown Hill in 1886. PJ was the killer. He had shot a neighbor and his wife during a long-standing and long-simmering land dispute over land in Lopez Canyon. They were arrested that afternoon, brought back to Rio Grande without incident, but a lynch mob broke into the jail that night, disguised themselves with handkerchiefs, and summarily lynched the 2 from the Pacific Coast Railway Bridge. My older brother met one of the members of the lynching party. He too was about PJ's age, 15 years old, and he came to talk to the bigger kids at Branch School one day. And he said, when we broke into the jail, we didn't expect her, but Mrs. Hemi was sitting there. And she knew exactly what was about to happen. He said, I will never get over that. And the man was in his mid-80s. This is a stagecoach ascending the San Marcos Pass in 1880. Mr. William G. Dana was quite upset because on one such trip, they made Mrs. Dana get out and walk so they could get over the grade. I'm not sure why. But he wrote the stagecoach company a testy letter. That stagecoach was robbed repeatedly by my favorite outlaw, and his name was Dick Fellows. He's my favorite because he's so incredibly inept. I love this man. I come from a family of horse lovers. both of my sisters. My big sister helps to run a boarding stable. I love horses too, from a distance. I wish they were built more like my Basset Hound. You wouldn't have so far to fall, would you? That was Dick Fellow's problem. He had some difficulty with horses. He came from Kentucky. His first stagecoach robbery after failing in the hog farming business was outside of San Fernando in the Cahuenga Pass. And this was in 1874, I think. But he stepped into the road, brandished his pistols, and stopped the coach. And at that moment, a passenger leaped out, also armed with a pistol, and started firing at Dick Fellows. Well, in the confusion, the stagecoach driver took advantage of the situation, whipped the horses into a gallop, and took off down the road, followed closely by Dick Fellows' horse, which took off down the road. So there was Fellows in the middle of the road staring at the passenger, this passenger staring back, and the passenger shrugged, handed over his revolver. Dick Fellows robbed him and sent him back to San Fernando. He went to San Quentin, where he was a model prisoner, chaplain's assistant, thank you very much, and taught Spanish and moral philosophy. He was paroled and he resumed robbing stagecoaches, but this time it was in a little town near Bakersfield, Caliente. And he was out after a Wells Fargo stage reputed to have a large amount of cash in its strongbox. And once again, he selected an ambush spot, was mounted on his horse, ready to go. And just as the stagecoach appeared, Dick Fellows' horse bucked, threw him to the ground, and knocked him unconscious at the exact moment the stagecoach passed through the ambush spot. He later found out that there was $240,000 in the Wells Fargo strongbox. But this was a persistent man. He said, by golly, if I didn't get it the first time, I'll get it on the trip back. So he waited for the stage again near Caliente in a new ambush spot with a new horse. And he stopped this one. And the driver threw down the strongbox. And just as he was hoisting the strongbox up to the pommel of his horse, the horse bolted, took off. The strongbox fell on Dick Fellows' foot. Cursing, sweating, and swearing, he dragged it in the dark until he fell over a cliff and broke his leg. Fortunately, he was near a mining camp, managed to steal a horse and make his getaway. The horse had just been shod with 3 horseshoes and 1 mule shoe, which made it ridiculously easy for the Kern County Sheriff to track Dick Fellows, arrest him, and put him into San Quentin for a second time. He was once again a good boy and was paroled, but by golly, he had got stagecoach robbery into his blood. So he switched his theater of operations to San Luis Obispo County. He robbed a Santa Barbara stage twice, a San Luis Obispo stage once, and a stage from King City once, before he was finally caught by a Wells Fargo detective. He was remanded to the custody of the Santa Barbara sheriff for a stagecoach robbery he'd pulled near Los Alamos, which was notorious for outlaws in those days. Well, unfortunately, in the Los Alamos job, he had stolen the driver's gold pocket watch, which was engraved with the driver's name, which was found in Dick Fellows' pocket. So it did not take the jury very long to convict him. So he was in the Santa Barbara County Jail awaiting transportation to the brand new prison at Folsom when the deputy brought him breakfast. Fellows, instead of eating his breakfast, jumped the deputy, knocked him to the ground, dashed out the front door of the jail, jumped onto a horse, went pell-mell for leather down Santa Barbara Street, made a sharp left turn, and his horse ran into another horse. Bucked him off. He's lying in the middle of the street, and he's quickly surrounded by 7 enthusiastic men and 1 teenager, all of them armed. They took him back to jail, where he asked the deputy if he couldn't have his breakfast now. He's kind of lovable. What Dan was talking about is obviously much more serious. Our outlaw history really begins with the gold rush. I love this picture, and you've seen others like it, I'm sure. These are deserted ships in San Francisco Bay in 1851. The crews have all headed for the gold fields. And every once in a while, one of these ships shows up. There's a saloon, you can see the Transamerica Pyramid from it, where I don't know if they still have yuppies, but those are the kind of people that frequent this place, yuppies. It's called the Old Ship Saloon. And last year they were excavating, and by golly, there was the old ship, which had been lost since the San Francisco earthquake. She was not bringing gold miners, she was bringing a load of Methodists. Nice people. These Methodists were missionaries, and they were bound and determined to Christianize the wickedness of the gold fields when their ship ran aground on Alcatraz. They had to tow her across the bay, beach her on Beach Street, and she was quickly converted. A hole was cut in the side of the Arkansas, the masts were cut off, the lumber was in such short supply, and she began a very un-Methodist career, first as a saloon, then as a brothel, and then as a saloon again, before she was found in 2016. Well, the relevance to our county is that 3 of the San Miguel mission killers were ship jumpers from San Francisco. 2 of them were sailors, Irish-born, that deserted from a U.S. Navy ship. A third was from another Navy ship. And these were the men who, in December of 1848, rode down El Camino Real from Mission Soledad. They were a party of 6 altogether. And they met William Reed, who was innkeeper at San Miguel. It was a frequent stopping place for travelers. He had just been to the gold fields, and like local cattlemen, and like Levi Strauss, for example, Reed realized the money wasn't to be made in mining gold. That was for suckers. The money was to be made in supplying the needs of the gold miners. He had just made a big deal. He'd sold a herd of sheep to a broker in the gold country, had come back, and Mr. Reed was evidently a trusting soul. He made the mistake of bragging that the pouch he brought back was so heavy with gold dust that his little boy couldn't lift it. That caught the ears of the 6 men, who pretended to leave the next day, turned around and came back, and that night murdered William Reed, his wife, and 8 other people. His wife was 8 months pregnant at the time. The bodies were discovered by the famous mountain man Jim Beckwourth, who was riding north from Nadana Adobe on his mail route. Beckwourth also, by the way, found the body of the scalped Jedediah Smith. If you've seen the film The Revenant, he found the body of the scalped Hugh Glass. It's my opinion that it's not a good thing if Jim Beckwourth rides up your driveway one day. He found the bodies, went to a nearby rancho, brought back a group of vaqueros, and eventually John Michael Price and Francis Branch, who had also been traveling to the gold fields, came to the mission, discovered the bodies of the Reed family, and Price, who was an alcalde, summoned out a posse. It was a second posse that finally caught up with the killers. It's fascinating. I just was driving down to Santa Barbara this weekend, and I thought to myself, 101 is essentially El Camino Real. So I'm seeing the same terrain, the same mountains, the same scenery that these killers would have seen. They were eventually caught there was a gunfight on the beach at Summerland. One of the outlaws was killed. One of the posse members was killed. A second one, for some unexplainable reason, tried to escape by swimming out to sea. He didn't make it. He was shot to death, and the 3 survivors, one of them had escaped, were brought back to Santa Barbara and put on trial by a jury of local citizens. And the transcripts for that trial are one of the things that I found at the Mission Santa Barbara archives. It's absolutely fascinating. They were executed near a California pizza kitchen, which I don't think was there then, but at the corner of De La Guerra and Chapala Street by a firing squad, a U.S. Army firing squad. Because also in hot pursuit of the killers was a man famous to Californians. He would eventually be a Civil War general. He commanded the firing squad. His name was Lieutenant Edward O.C. Ord, for whom Fort Ord is named. So that was the end of the Santa Barbara killers, but not the end of our troubles. Isn't that a wonderful picture? Look at all that open space around the mission. The outlaw that probably had the most impact on our county in the 1850s was headquartered from time to time with his gang at Mission Santa Barbara, and his name was Jack Powers. He was Irish born, he was an immigrant, raised in New York City, Manhattan, Hell's Kitchen, and the Bowery, and he came to California as a volunteer during the Mexican War with a regiment called Stevenson's Regiment. They were stationed in Santa Barbara, which was a pretty wild place. 2,000 people and 35 saloons. My ancestors are from Ireland, and I dare say I can't think of a single Irish town of that size with that many pubs. Santa Barbara also went through 2 sheriffs in the 1850s, both of them assassinated. So this was a wild place, as was San Luis Obispo. Powers, I love movies from the 30s and 40s, and if I were to cast for Powers, I would probably pick an actor named Tyrone Power, who was in The Mark of Zorro, handsome, dashing, also of Irish descent. Powers was charismatic. He was a graceful dancer, which meant that the women of Santa Barbara loved him. Like most of the Irish, he adored horses and was a superb rider, which meant that the men of Santa Barbara adored him too. He also liked to bet, especially on himself. The Pioneer Racetrack, he rode a race there. 10,000 people came to watch Jack Powers ride. And that's 1 out of 6 people in the city of San Francisco that year, in 1853. He was also a killer and the head of the outlaw gang that plagued San Luis Obispo County during the violent 1850s. And primarily the gang's victims were cattle buyers who usually traveled alone on El Camino Real with large amounts of gold dust or cash. So they were relatively easy pickings. If somebody was, say, coming down the Cuesta or headed up the Cuesta and Powers wanted to make some money, then Linares would be the guy who would spread the word. Linares was the son of a man who once owned the Los Osos Rancho that was bought by Captain John Wilson. He was also known as a barroom brawler, a bully, and a very, very tough man. What's interesting is that that house is still there. It's near San Luis Obispo High School. And I'm told, and have no wish to find out, that Pio Linares is still there too. It's amazing. I can scream like a little girl when I want to. This was a gang that would have made anybody scream. Their motto was, "Dead men tell no tales." They left no witnesses. Dan has written about, and there are plenty of accounts of finding the skeletal remains of cattle buyers, even of an entire family between here and Santa Barbara along El Camino Real. There were turned up about as often as Anderson's pea soup signs. These killings were carried out by the Jack Powers gang. Powers was such a good horseman. He would do a job, pull a job, say, in Los Alamos, get a string of horses from a local rancher who was a friend, and he'd be back in Santa Barbara, backslapping people and buying drinks for the house before anybody knew it. So that was his alibi. San Luis Obispo was tiny, so a gang, and I don't imagine that Powers' gang was ever more than about a dozen men, absolutely had a sway over the people of San Luis Obispo. They lived in fear. And I love startling statistics, but I found this during the course of my research. This is from the FBI Uniform Crime Reports. Okay, 47 homicides per 100,000 people. And then I ran across a scholarly article by a professor at San Diego State, and using the same statistical analysis, San Luis Obispo County's homicide rate in the 1850s would have been 178 per 100,000. Okay, so this was the most violent place in America in the 1850s. 1858, a couple of things coincided. One was, in rapid succession, the murders of 5 people over the Cuesta Grade. The other one was the incensed attitude of Walter Murray, who was a young lawyer, had moved to San Luis Obispo from the gold fields, and was distraught that he could not get a conviction in the juzgado, in the room that we're in, for Californios who had been so obviously guilty of committing some of these depredations. So Murray was the man who was instrumental in founding the Vigilance Committee. There's his name at the top of the list. And it was the Vigilance Committee who, during the summer of 1858, would break up the Jack Powers gang. I wondered about his motivation, and then I found this tintype of Walter Murray and his little girl. And then I found his tombstone, which is right across the road from the Elks Lodge in the San Luis Obispo Cemetery. And it's a man's hand and a woman's hand clasped, saying farewell. He died very young, he was only 49. So it's my supposition that Murray's motivation was he was not willing to raise a family in a place that was so incredibly violent, when he decided to take action. The action the Vigilance Committee would take included a 2-day running gun battle near Turry Road in the Los Osos Valley. One citizen was killed, a young man, and Murray himself was wounded in the arm. But before the gun battle ended, they had shot and killed Powers-Linares. So that was the end of Jack Powers as lieutenant here in San Luis Obispo. The remainder of the gang met pretty swift justice. They were hanged after being sentenced by the Executive Committee of the Vigilance Committee. There are 5 streets in San Luis Obispo named after members of the Executive Committee who actually decided on final punishment. And they were hanged here in front of Mission San Luis Obispo. And that was pretty much the end of Linares gang. Jack Powers would flee to Mexico. He would get into an argument with another outlaw over a woman. Powers would lose, and he would be shot to death, and that was the end of Jack Powers. I want to note we had many extra-legal executions. We did have one legal one, just one. And it was carried out, he charged $20 for the hanging by that man. Francisco Castro was a county sheriff for 7 years, and he hanged a murderer. We didn't have San Quentin or Folsom yet for executions. He hanged a murderer right outside the windows here in 1859. But this is another interesting thing. His house is still here too. Greatly expanded, but it's on Ontario Road. 20 years after the hanging, Castro was a tough man, got into a dispute with a neighbor out in his front yard. Castro pulled his revolver. It misfired. The neighbor pulled his revolver. It didn't. A bullet hit Francisco Castro, who still couldn't get his revolver to fire, but he used it to beat the man to death in the road before he died of his gunshot wound. Relatively tame and calm were these 2 young fellows, Frank and Jesse James, who stayed with their Uncle Jury, played at being cowboy. The vaqueros tried not to laugh at them because Jesse was a superb rider, but they didn't know the first thing about roping cattle. Jesse also liked to show off his skill with a Colt Army revolver at rattlesnakes and jackrabbits, so they learned not to say anything about his roping skills. But they lived here. This is before their outlaw careers began. Jesse had been a Confederate guerrilla with William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson in Missouri, where the Civil War was vicious. The Republican Reconstruction government had just come to power in Missouri, so Frank and Jesse thought it best to leave Missouri and stay with their Uncle Jury for a while. They also looked for their father's grave. Their father was a Baptist missionary who died in the gold country. They never found him. They would be, eventually, their Uncle Jury would buy them passage back to Missouri. They would leave in early 1869, and a little later that year, they would commit their first bank job in the bank in Gallatin, Missouri. Jesse shot the teller to death when Frank tried to change a $100 bill because he thought the teller had been a Union sympathizer who had betrayed one of Jesse's friends during the war. It turned out that was not true. It was a case of mistaken identity. So Jesse James killed an innocent man. And his career course would come to an end in 1882, courtesy of Bob Ford. The Jesse James gang rode with their cousins, the Youngers. And That man's mother was a younger. That's Bill Dalton, who was a respectable rancher who lived in the North County. He liked barbecues, and he was entertaining his other brothers who were visiting from the Midwest in the fall of 1891 into early 1892. They liked to barbecue, and they liked to shoot their pistols, and they liked to do those things together. And sometimes they did them during the church services at the Estrella Adobe Church, which must have been very distracting for those trying to pray. Well, the Daltons would eventually go back to the Midwest, where in 1892 they would attempt to rob 2 banks simultaneously in the town of Coffeyville, Kansas. This is how it ended. That's Bob and Grat Dalton in the middle there with 2 other members of the Outlaw Gang. That was not the end of the Dalton Gang, and I still do not understand why. But Bill decided to leave the Paso Robles area, go back home, and reform the gang again. His outlaw career lasted about 2 years before he was shot to death. I forgot Emmett. Emmett was the smart one. Emmett survived the raid at Coffeyville, which is amazing because he was shot 23 times. He eventually became an advisor for Hollywood on Western scripts. And here he is. He's autographed a picture to our county sheriff, Jess Lowry, in the late 1820s. Bill would be shot to death in Oklahoma by the sheriff on the left, and that would be the end of his career in 1894. And I am reminded by my friend David Middlecamp, who writes a wonderful column for the Tribune, that the Eagles came to Cuesta in 1974, just after the release of Desperado, their great concept album, which of course is about the Dalton Gang. And there's no other connection to history other than the opening act was Neil Young, and tickets were $5. I did not go to that concert, and I still do not understand why I did not go to that concert. Yes, ma'am.
Are your books available online?
Yeah, they're available on Amazon.com. And the History Press books, the second book I published myself, but the Arroyo Grande book and the Outlaws book will also be at Barnes & Noble as well. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. It was a delight.